All right, so actually for me it's quite exciting to see everyone that's here. It's also an exciting time for space research. I think one of the things that I want to make sure that at least I get across is my hopes that we are actually at a new time frame with actually pushing the envelope of what we could do in space, especially in biological research. If you look at least looking at my background and where I came into space, you'll see that a lot of the research that is done in space is limited. It's been limited for multiple reasons, but now with ISS being complete, we actually have an envelope to open and push our understanding of space. Next slide, please. And so my background is in evolutionary biology and molecular evolutionary biology. And so I always think in that gradient and flow of how we define results and see the changes that occur. I have the top area, and you know, I saw that Howard, of course, discussed plants. But usually you have the flow from the unicellular and cell culture going to invertebrates and vertebrates. And if you look at this progression of discussions that we had here, of course, Ruth gave her talk just before me. And actually, I think it's a good introduction to invertebrates and why invertebrates are useful tools. First of all, one of the key things that you'll see is that the list is similar to what you would say are good for ground research. Invertebrates